Recently, I finished Leo Tolstoy's Russian epic, War and Peace, a 1,369-page book composed of 4 volumes and 2 epilogues. It is a historical fiction book about Napoleon Bonaparte's 1812 invasion of Russia. The story follows the Russian aristocratic perspective of this invasion and how it affects Russian society during this time period. And for me, it was one of the most incredible and unique reading experiences of my life. And I think this is a book that uh, everybody can read and everybody should read if they can. This book sort of has this legendary status of being this epic tome of literature, which it is, deservedly so. But do not let that scare you from reading it. It is actually like probably one of the most readable classics I've ever read. Of the books that I've read and the different styles of prose that I've been exposed to, none, and I mean none, compare to that of Leo Tolstoy. I mean, he is truly in a league of his own. There's a famous quote from a Russian writer, Isaac Babel, that goes, "If the world could write itself, it would write like Tolstoy." Now, I'd heard this quote before I read War and Peace, and I didn't really know what to make of it. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but after having read War and Peace, which is the only work of Leo Tolstoy that I've read, I completely uh, understand this quote. It makes so much sense. It's the only way of uh, expressing the incredible style of Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy has this remarkable ability at characterization and not just for the main characters, but just for characters who show up for like a page or two. He brings them to life. I mean, they're all alive. If I were to put it in my own words, I would describe Tolstoy's writing as compassionate. I mean, he'll write characters that they do some disagreeable things or questionable things that are bad, but he doesn't condemn them. He shows you like some of the reasons why they may act in this way, but um, we shouldn't just completely hate them for this one reason. I mean, either they're having a bad day or a bad moment. Um, but you really he gives you the chance to forgive these characters. So this book was written over 150 years ago, but it is alive. I mean, this feels like a box with actual people and places inside of it, and it's like you just open it up and you're just put into this world of it's just there's no other way of describing it. I'm sort of tongue tied talking about it, but it's just truly like the fact that I'm tongue tied just shows you like how great this is. When I started this book, it felt like Leo Tolstoy himself, like, walked up to me, put his arm around my shoulder, and walked me through a variety of scenes and places and showed me like the destruction and horror of war and, how it affects not only the individual but the society at large and, this just all this horror and for what. So here are some tips that I have for you if you haven't read War and Peace and you're looking to read it. Um, there are some things that some people should know before they get into this book. So the first tip I have is make sure you find a good translation of the book. If you're reading a really long novel, you don't want to have a bad translation because it can squander the entire experience of an otherwise great book. And the second tip that I would have for you is become loosely acquainted with the Napoleonic War era and the 1812 invasion of Russia. And don't worry, I don't mean like go out and read a bunch of books on the topic, but like go read, maybe skim through like a Wikipedia article or go listen to a podcast on the subject, just enough so that you have a little bit of context going into the book. And earlier this year, I'd read a book called Napoleon: A Life by Andrew Roberts. I read this before I had any intention of reading War and Peace, but the stuff that I learned in this book really enhanced the experience of reading War and Peace because I was able to sort of place the events in my mind. And uh, when you get introduced to a whole bunch of names and places, just having a little bit of background will, you know, keep you up to date on what's going on. So the third tip I would have for you is find a way of keeping track of all the characters in the book. There are a lot of them. There's a lot of different families, and some of the people in these families have the same first names as people in other families, so it can get kind of confusing really quickly. So I'd recommend, as I said, writing down the names or finding a resource with a character list or a family tree of all the different families in the book. Um, The translation that I had actually had one of these resources in the back, which I had to refer to for about the first 200 or so pages. But after that point, I, sort of got my groove and I knew who was who, and I didn't need to refer to it for the rest of the book. The fourth tip that I would have is be wary of the fact that some characters have more than one name, and Tolstoy seems to flip between the names at random. So, you'll have a character like Prince Andrei Balkonsky. Sometimes he'll be referred to as Andrei, sometimes as Balkonsky. Um, and, there's many different cases of this happening throughout the book with different characters. So it's just something to be wary of because out of nowhere, it seems like there's a whole new character that, seemingly showed up out of nowhere, but it's actually just the same character with it, and Tolstoy is referring to them with a different name. So it can be a bit confusing, but again, it's one of those things that you adjust to after like the first 100 or 200 pages, and then you like don't even think about it after that point. The fifth tip that I would have is make sure you understand that this is not a conventional novel. I mean, as I mentioned before, Tolstoy takes time to break off from the story, and he directly philosophizes about, history. Uh, he asks questions like, "What is free will? What force causes nations to move against one another? What causes men to slaughter one another?" It's some pretty heavy stuff, and if you're not interested in that, you can skip those chapters, and it won't be a detriment to the story, but I wouldn't really advise doing so because it really helps, sort of get the message through, to the reader. The second epilogue is devoted entirely to philosophy. So the story itself ends in the first epilogue. Once you get to the second epilogue, it's entirely Tolstoy himself just speaking to you directly. So those are the 5 tips that I would have for reading War and Peace. I'm sure there's a few others that I can list, but I think those, in my opinion, are like the 5 big ones. I know this book is daunting, but it is absolutely worth the effort, and I want to reiterate that it is one of the most readable classics that I personally have ever read, and I think anybody can read. I think the one thing that sort of stops people from reading it is just the sheer size of the book. Um, when you read a big book like War and Peace, or like Infinite Jest or Middlemarch, or pick your book. Um, the way I look at it is I don't see reading like I don't say like I'm reading War and Peace. I'm like I read 50 pages a day, and I just happen to be reading War and Peace. So I think of reading as an activity as opposed to like the activity of just reading one book. Hopefully that makes sense, but the psychology of it, helps you get through these long books. Certainly helps me. So hopefully I made a good case for checking out the book. If you don't like it, that's totally fine. Um, I just happen to like it. I just want to share that excitement. This isn't a perfect book. There are some very valid criticisms of the book. Um, some of the points that Tolstoy makes, he sort of reiterates, several times over, and it can kind of get to the point where you're like, okay, Leo, I get it now. Like, can we get to the next thing? But, you know, and then there's some of the points that Tolstoy makes, I don't completely agree with. But, it's a fresh perspective on things. The philosophy of history that Tolstoy proposes is something I've never heard of. Uh, so it was like this whole new territory for me with these philosophical questions. So I do have criticisms of the book, but they are small in comparison to the praises I have for this book. Um, so I think it's worth checking out, even though it's over 150 years old. I think the questions that it raises, we should be thinking about in the modern day. Um, so yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if I convinced you in any way, shape, or form, or maybe you've decided like maybe I'll do it. You're not totally sold, but now you're harboring the idea. And if you've read War and Peace, let me know what you think of my sort of tips. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of them, or you have any more tips of your own to give to people. And yeah, just let me know in the comments. And thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.